While it's not one of my go-to genres, I've always been a fan of strategy games. When I was younger, I got into a lot of the now classic RTS releases before finally coming to terms with the fact that I'd never developed the micromanagement skills to be great at them, and decided to stick to games with a smaller scale. Stuff like XCOM and Fire Emblem are addictive when things go well, but I really like the blend of real-time you can find in some of the Tom Clancy games, and to a lesser extent the Mass Effect trilogy. Blending the frenetic energy of a third-person shooter with calculated strategy isn't an easy task, and the subject of this video was tasked with doing exactly that. But first, we need to start with a history lesson. The original XCOM was considered one of the best games ever released on a floppy disk, but none of the follow-up releases ever managed to repeat the success of the first game. After 10 years and several embarrassing releases under Hasbro, the rights to the franchise eventually ended up in the hands of 2K, who wanted to put Irrational Games and 2K Australia on the project. Since those companies were busy with BioShock 1 and 2 respectively, development wouldn't start until early 2010, and when the game was revealed at that year's E3, fans weren't too happy.
Betrayal!
What?
Betrayal! Betrayed me! This game sucks!
This reboot of XCOM not only changed the setting to the 1950s and had more of an X-Files feel or a mystery plotline, but it showed clear parallels to the BioShock series in terms of gameplay. Some articles were even calling it a survival horror game. The development of this project would stall for a while because much of the team was reassigned to work on BioShock Infinite, which was also facing behind-the-scenes trouble. Without strong leadership, production was then shifted to 2K's Marin studio in California, who made the decision to scrap everything and start over. They wanted to inject the game with some much-needed tactical elements, making it play more like a sci-fi version of Brothers in Arms or Rainbow Six Vegas. It looked like the project was coming closer to what an XCOM reboot should be, but news about this project was still pretty minimal. And then in 2012, somebody else rebooted XCOM first.
Hello, Commander.
Firaxis had been developing an extremely faithful reboot of the original XCOM since 2008, and for some reason 2K just didn't feel a need to tell the public this. But since this game was extremely good, and it saved the series from development hell, everyone just assumed that the original idea had been canned. Instead, it was rebooted yet again, this time as a complete spin-off. The Bureau, XCOM Declassified, was revealed in April of 2013 to be released only a few months later in August. The Bureau's story plays out more like an origin for the XCOM project rather than a complete reboot. The year is 1962. US government officials are meeting to discuss the possibility of an invasion by extraterrestrials, which is scoffed at by J. Edgar Hoover.
Soviet operatives have penetrated the very highest levels of our military and government. It is a fact.
The NSA is not convinced that this is a Soviet operation.
Director Falk, is this going to devolve into another one of your outsider briefings?
A disgraced CIA agent by the name of William Carter is waiting to provide a briefcase with some sort of alien material, but a woman under alien influence shoots him in the shoulder, chokes him out, and then tries to steal the contents. When Carter comes to, she's been completely burnt to a crisp, his wound is healed, and UFOs are attacking the base. So we assume control of him and fight through the area alongside some fellow agents in order to get out alive. This opening stage is fairly typical of first-person shooters. The invasion provides some suitable set-piece moments and teaches you how to command your squad mates and use some of the more complicated abilities, which is really the bread and butter of the game. It's pretty clear right out the gate that the Bureau takes a lot of inspiration from the Mass Effect series as far as the gameplay. You have two squad mates with their own set of powers and skill trees who can be commanded on a wheel that pauses the action. But in the Bureau, time is not completely stopped, and you have much greater control over where the soldiers move, use their powers, or engage targets. You're encouraged to chain orders together before returning to real time, in part because it's not possible to hotkey commands on the D-pad in this game. You only have the ability to tell both agents to attack one target, or relocate to a position, and you use the same button for both orders, so good luck being precise. Regardless of that hiccup, the Battle Focus menu is a really good improvement on the standard menu from Mass Effect, and you'll need to pick it up fast because the Bureau does try to retain the hardcore sensibilities that XCOM players want. Every agent you bring into battle can be customized through name, appearance, background, and class. There's 4 to pick from, and their trees tend to fork at certain points, so picking 2 of each type is a good way to cover everything. The weapons that they can use are tied to the class, but everybody can equip different backpacks that provide additional bonuses. Commandos get automatic weapons, which make them solid fighters, but they can also stagger enemies by pushing them with a force wave or drawing them in with taunts. Later they can pick between a big AoE attack and a shield buff for allies. Engineers have 2 types of deployable mines that scatter or damage enemies, but their real strength comes in later when they can summon a turret. Recon agents have the only power that deals direct damage to targets, as well as a distraction or cloak and a long-range artillery strike. Support is pretty obvious. They can help you fight harder with combat stims and protect you with a bubble shield, and they're also capable of stripping away armor or shields from enemies, which will come in handy on the later missions. Carter has his own special squad leader class, which is more or less an alternate type of support. He starts with a group heal, which is essential since health only restores at the end of fights. He can stagger foes with a biotic lift that can also be used to lift up the turrets, although unfortunately that's the only time that powers in this game can directly synergize. Besides that, he gets a little alien blob that he can spawn as a minion, as well as a hover drone that can be upgraded to lift enemies or heal your team. By the end, he gets mind control. So that's fun. Since some classes don't become particularly useful until the late game, it's important to make sure that your agents don't die, because permadeath is still the standard here. If one does fall, you might be able to get a replacement at a checkpoint, and there's always a grace period where they can be revived. But this is dependent on how high the difficulty is. On the hardest mode, agents can't be revived, only stabilized. As far as the game's weaponry, there's really not that much to say. It does follow the tech progression from the original game, which is nice. You start with the conventional weapons of the era, then move up to laser guns, and finally green plasma. There's no research that has to be done here. If you find an unused gun in a level, you can equip it onto any class that can carry it, but if you neglect to pick these up, you will automatically get them later. One of the few special weapons in the game is the blaster launcher, which, true to the strategy games, is disgustingly powerful. It fires 3 missiles with each pull of the trigger, and each one of them does way too much damage. You can only carry 9 total rounds, but that's enough to take out most bosses in just a few seconds. There is a secret Tesla cannon that you can find in the finale, but honestly it's just not that useful. Most of the game's enemies take the form of the Outsiders, who operate as fairly standard shooter enemies. They come in a lot of varieties though, and the commanders are the one to watch out for, since they always have some kind of ability like spawning minions or buffing allies. Others will just cloak or teleport and try to get in your face. There's a lot of abilities that the enemies can employ, and if you can't see exactly what's happening, your squad mates will do a pretty good job at letting you know through audio cues, which is something I appreciate.
We got hostiles! There's a commander here! These drones are pretty damn helpful! There's a pair of things!
There are also a few classic enemies mixed in as well. You have your sectoids, who are still the fodder, mutons are big tanky guys, combat drones appear alongside the sectopod, which is probably my favorite looking enemy in the game. Some of these foes will have protective armor on various points that needs to be destroyed before you can do any real damage, and I appreciate that this is something visually represented instead of just being a second health bar like shields. Overall, the gameplay, it's fine. There could have been some fine-tuning to the movement controls, but I think the tactical elements all work as intended. Really, the biggest problem is just that the level design is bland. This game sticks very close to the third-person shooter formula of its time. Lots of chest-high walls, etc. At several points, you'll finish fighting through a section only to have fresh waves of enemies spawn in from the way you just came, and it honestly feels like an excuse just to get as much mileage out of these areas as possible. There's a few arenas that feel more open, but they only really show up at the end of levels. Outside of the game's core combat, you'll be spending time at XCOM's base, where you can create new agents, train, read some lore, and talk to people. It's basically the Normandy from Mass Effect with a few key differences. In addition to recruiting squad mates, you can also send them out on dispatch missions, which means you won't be able to use them in your next combat session, but when you finish they'll come back with experience and new equipment. This is the only way to ensure that you'll have solid replacements should you lose anybody. There's also several side quests you can do at the base, which really range in quality, and usually just lead to unlocking dispatch missions. For something with more substance, you want to do the side operations, which are quick little missions that still provide solid rewards and XP. Even if you're not interested in that, you're probably going to want to do these just to extend your playtime. Including the introductory mission, the Bureau has a total of 7 story missions, most of which feel about an hour in length. Because of this, the plot's pacing can be a little rushed, and these side missions do at least help with that. Conversing with the game's other characters will reveal another element that 2K shamelessly borrowed from Mass Effect to less success: the dialogue wheel. It feels completely unnecessary. The options don't change the dynamic of the scene very much. There are attempts to integrate choices into the game, but they really don't have an impact on anything, and they're not acknowledged properly half the time. There is at least one good implementation of it, but we're going to save that for later. If you judge this game's graphics based on the year it came out, then I would say that the art design is okay, but the graphics just aren't up to par. I appreciate that they tried to make some things a little more colorful to make them pop, and I think that is noticeable compared to some of the other shooters from the era. My overall favorite touch of the art design are these Sleepwalkers that you'll find in many of the missions. These are people who are infected by an alien virus, and it turns some of them into double agents, but most of them just kind of walk around and think that nothing has happened. It can be creepy to just be moving through missions and see people doing whatever they were doing right before they were attacked. I think it adds a lot more than, say, countless audio logs strewn all over the place, which of course they have. Besides that, the alien decor is okay. It's fairly traditional, but it doesn't feel super generic, although it does become stale by the game's end. The more human areas are the interesting ones, but not interesting enough that I would say that this game's art design is a selling point. The general plot of the game is pretty standard. XCOM in this timeline is meant to be a secret bureau that was created to deal with the threat of a sudden Soviet invasion. But now they're the last line of defense against aliens who are trying to enslave everyone. The Outsiders, or Zujari as they're also called, are powered by a sort of hive mind called Mosaic, which is really the key to their success. After rescuing a scientist who's already been researching their tech, you embark on a few high-stakes missions to hit the aliens' command structure. As mentioned earlier, I really started to feel like the plot was moving faster than it should. By mission number 4, I honestly thought I might be at the very end of the game, and the story doesn't have a lot of frills up to this point. Truthfully, things do pick up, and because of that, I'm going to issue a spoiler warning for anyone who's actually curious about playing the game for themselves. Please skip ahead to this time code if you don't want to hear anything. Still here? Okay. So mission number 5 involves most of the game's cast suiting up on a UFO and heading through an alien portal to drop a bomb on their planet and disable the Mosaic network. This is a fine Independence Day style finale, but unfortunately most of the mission just takes place at Hoover Dam. Only the final firefight is actually on the Outsiders' world. There's not even a boss battle here. You confront the alien's leader, who's called Origin, and he's sitting in some kind of weird vertical bathtub. Thankfully, he does provide some pretty good insight into what the aliens are actually trying to do on Earth.
What does that mean? What do you want with me?
It is not you that we require. It is the demon that controls you.
Start making sense.
The demon has been hiding on your world for ages, waiting. Planning for the day it would reveal itself.
A case. At Groom Range. What was in the case?
With our arrival, it has awakened and chosen its prisoner. You. Reveal yourself, demon.
No!
Reveal yourself and be ours.
At this point, I was really hoping that Carter would bust out some new ethereal powers to beat up Origin, but instead we just use a quick-time event to suck up his ethereal into our Power Fist. Then you just fly home without even doing anything, and looks like the game's over, although they might be hinting that Origin made it through the portal and he's still alive. Honestly, I was kinda just waiting for the credits to roll here, but we're actually not done. XCOM's director Falk tells us that we have one final battle in Chicago to destroy what's left of the alien network on the planet. But then the ethereal that was part of Mosaic wakes up and causes the similar creature to reveal itself. And then a dialogue wheel pops up, because we've actually been playing as this blue ethereal attached to Carter for the entire game.
My name is William Carter. Who the fuck are you? You speak with William Carter's voice, but only because you do not yet know your own.
No, I'm William Carter, but I am also something more.
You have bonded to William Carter. He is a piece of you now, in this world, but you transcend his existence.
It seemed to have been dormant in whatever form it took when it was inside of that briefcase, and the same process that saved Carter's life took away his free will.
William Carter was injured, dying. His mind reached out in pain and fear. A war was beginning, and then I was William Carter, and we were fighting the war.
These cutscenes that appear earlier in the game, where Carter is traumatized by the death of his family, were actually the real Carter, unable to control himself inside of his own mind. The Elder Ethereal had attempted to control one of the Outsiders, but they found a way to fight back and used her to power Mosaic. Because of that, she wants to exterminate everyone and keep the knowledge hidden. As the Ethereal, you can argue with her about this, but it doesn't end up mattering since Carter gets pissed enough to break free and he kills the cosmic being with bullets, somehow. It's not long after this that the Outsiders start attacking XCOM's base directly. We're still controlling Carter going forward, although he's completely aware of what's going on, and he's not always compliant. There's a moment near the end where he actually is able to detach himself from you, which leads to a brief section where we play around in our true form. I'm kind of glad there's no button prompt here telling you just to press X to take him over again, at least. You have to figure that out for yourself. Ultimately, Carter does have enough strength to resist you, and he threatens to kill himself in order to destroy both of you.
Get out of my head, now, or I'll blow us all to Kingdom Come. I'd rather kill us all than be your puppet 1 second longer. Wonder if you feel the same way. Well, I guess we're about to find out.
If you don't leave him at this point, the game will end immediately and just give you the credits. But this is not the end. When you do leave Carter, you're given the option to instead control one of the game's other characters, and this choice will decide who you go into the final mission playing as.
Merge with me, and let's end this together.
Say goodnight, Gracie. Damn fool.
Take him into custody. It's time.
This finale isn't particularly amazing on its own. It does involve going onto an alien space station and battling against some pretty tough formations. You'll have to make a few choices about who to save and who to leave to die. Carter is still around, but now he's a big asshole who just wants the Ethereal dead, no matter what. You're actually given the option to kill him at one point, and I don't think that most players are going to want to do that considering that they really thought they were playing as him for most of the game. The game really does go through a lot of lengths to remove Carter's agency in this finale. I was actually a bit shocked when I heard this line.
Remarkable. The Ethereal must have allowed Carter to communicate like this with his squad. Perhaps this ability is what inspired the creation of Mosaic.
Even the very mechanics of the game are explained as being a product of the alien possession. Does that count as a fourth wall break? It might. There's other conversations where they talk about how Carter really isn't a particularly great person. You can read his dossier earlier in the game, and it paints the portrait of someone who's very reckless and irresponsible. But he never really acts that way in the game, probably because you were never really him. I'm not entirely sure if this twist is something that survived all of the various incarnations of this game's development, or maybe it was just thought up later with the last version because they wanted there to be something memorable at the end, but either way, I am really glad that they were able to put this together. It does help things wrap up on a creative high note when they otherwise might not have. And it is a pretty good implementation of doing a kind of story element that only really works in a video game. But aside from that, things wrap up in a pretty standard way. The ending is slightly different depending on which character you merged with, but they're all generally the same. All the evidence of the alien invasion is erased or explained away as communist attacks. That's a bit of a stretch, but I'm more concerned about Hoover since he was killed and isn't supposed to be dead for like 10 years. They don't make any mention of that in the ending. One thing I do appreciate about the ending is that the character who merged with the Ethereal is talking to a man who we've never heard before, but something about his voice sounded familiar.
A questionable decision. Even with the outsiders gone, evidence remained.
It turns out that he's voiced by John Bailey, who is the same actor who has voiced the XCOM councilman.
As of now, Resistance forces are currently somewhat disorganized.
I'm not entirely sure if this was an intentional reference, but if it is the case, I do appreciate it as some kind of subtle means of bridging the gap between what Firaxis is doing and what the rest of 2K had been trying to do for years. It's just a shame that we don't really find out what happens to Carter in the epilogue, assuming he survived. I think he deserved a little more. So that about wraps it up. The Bureau may have been a game with very troubled development, and it probably could have been a lot better if they had a solid team working on it from the start. Considering how much of a struggle it was to make, I think it is a genuinely good game. It certainly tried to bring some level of strategy back to third-person shooters, which had really been missing, and kind of still is. There's definitely not ever going to be a sequel to this. 2K Marin experienced layoff troubles not long after. I recall reading a now-deleted message board post from someone who claimed to work on this game, saying that this is easily the game with the most executive meddling that 2K has ever produced. Most of what could have made it truly stand out and special was replaced with established tropes, things that had worked for other games. And the end result is something that does work. It's not the worst thing ever, as I've heard some people paint it out, although full disclosure, it does have its share of glitches, and it is very obvious that the game had basically no polish. If you're interested in the idea, I'd highly recommend picking up a copy. I seem to see it on sale quite a bit. And make no mistake, I really do love the proper XCOM games, and I don't really think the Bureau deserves to be seen as any kind of blemish on the rest of the series. If anything, I kinda wish that it got remembered by a little more than just a fedora. That's about it for this video. Please, let me know what you thought of it below. Share it to anyone who you know who's into XCOM, because they probably never played this game and just heard it was horrible. The tumultuous development on the project, it's a pretty interesting story on its own. I think I'm going to link an article or two about it, so you can read that if you're curious. Thank you so much for watching. My hope is to be getting some shorter videos out after this, and I hope you'll stick around for them. See ya.